Civilization 7 has had a wild and frankly turbulent week, one stacked with small, rapid patch updates and a series of swift responses from Firaxis. Responses, of course, to problems, feeling like disaster after disaster after disaster for Civilization 7 this week. So let's see how it's going in these turbulent times, with a view also to look to where it might be heading next. Well, obviously people haven't taken to Civilization 7 all that well. Steam reviews, just one platform, and it's important to keep that in mind as we move through, but a fairly significant one and a historical one for the Civilization franchise, revealing around half of players actually dislike the game, enough to go ahead and leave it a bad review. And while I can hear some of you rolling your eyes into the back of your heads, bear with me. Let's take a look at the Steam charts, the player counts. You can see, firstly, that actually, as I'm recording this video, Civilization 7 is reaching or is about to touch an all-time high, around close to 85,000 concurrent players. If we zoom out just a little bit more, including the player count from the beginning of the advanced access period around the 5th, 6th of February, you can see that the game sort of reached around 55,000 players, dipping down a little bit and then releasing to the general public, seeing a surge upward. But it's also, of course, important to acknowledge that this surge upward isn't actually all that significant. Most players, the majority of players who are currently playing the game, were perhaps already playing during advanced access. At least the numbers would suggest that, assuming the players have carried through. This story gets really interesting though when we compare it to just a couple of other games. Civilization 6 is the most obvious one. Taking a look at its player count right now, it's still a very impressive and very healthy on Steam alone, over 50,000 players. It is decreasing over time in this view, but actually, generally speaking, Civilization 6 launched, dipped in popularity, and then gradually built up a player base from there. From its launch to its lows, and then gradually built people up as the 6 on 7 years passed. It's even more interesting and adds another flavor to this recipe when we look at Civilization 5. The live player counts for Civ 5 suggest it's roughly just as popular, if not slightly more popular in recent months, still pulling in 25,000 players on Steam a day. On Steam matters perhaps a little bit more here, as, it didn't come to consoles. People aren't playing this game actively on their PS4s or PS5s or what have you. It's really just a computer game. It's also important, of course, to acknowledge here, if we look at the zoomed out view, we can see that Civilization 5's hype, its player base, really started to plateau and then decline after the release of Civilization 6 in 2016. Some other peaks, you can see a C19 peak there probably, but generally the game has declined since it's been replaced by Civilization 6, a game that notably improved and continued to be built upon since its launch. I would also note though that it also kinda suggests that there's a Civilization game out there for everybody. Well, almost everybody. Except for you, Beyond Earth. Goodness gracious, Beyond Earth. All of these numbers are to say that Civilization 7 seems to be performing okay on PC, but the public reception, and really the level of disappointment, especially if we compare to Civilization 6 roughly at this time, cannot be overlooked. This is clear, obvious, and profound. And all of this is relevant to the second part of this video and our discussion about what on earth is going on with Civ 7 now, and what's going to happen next with it. And this time around, with Civilization 7, there's a huge, massive cohort of players who are not accounted for in these statistics, but who are also interested in those questions. Those questions about what's happening next with Civilization 7. I'm of course talking about the console players. A couple of quick caveats on those numbers that we just discussed. This time around, console players received the game at launch. The first time. It was not like that with 6, or Beyond Earth, or 5, or indeed the many other great Civilization games before that. I don't leave them out because they're bad. They're just decades old at this point, okay? I'm an old soul, but I've got to try and keep some relevance here. I do, okay? I just do. This likely leads to, of course, a more diluted player base, skewing numbers away from Steam and toward consoles at launch. How many people are playing this game on a Switch right now, and what does that look like? I'd love to see the answers to both of those questions. Speaking of platforms, of course, another small element adding to the spiciness, the wild launch week of Civilization 7, was the surprise announcement of Civ 7 VR. That was just sort of dropped out this week, releasing, of course, on MetaQuest 3 later this year. So, the reception on PC is, well, not as impressive as Civilization 6's was. And the player count numbers suggest a fairly timid response to Civilization 7 early on here in its native home on the PC. Why might that be? Well, it's time for a status report. Why is it that 1 in 2 players dislike the game, and why the timid reception? Well, the number one overarching, still maintained complaint has to be around the UI. The UI has seen some minor improvements, though, in this week alone. 3 patches have been, of course, rolled out to the game, and throughout those patches, really it was the UI that was focused on, as well as the other gripe, and the main thing that seems to be driving a lot of the negative reviews, and that is stability. Particularly, and something outside of my wheelhouse of experience, but it does seem particularly true in the multiplayer setting. If you are experiencing desync, or one player gets randomly disconnected and they're playing a save from yesterday or whatever it may be, you're not alone. You're also not alone, of course, if you're criticizing the DLC practice, the sales practice, the immediate DLC, Great Britain behind a paywall, etc., etc. I mean, we've been talking about that for months, so I'm not going to dwell on it here because the situation hasn't changed in this wild week, but it's there nonetheless. So too is that bad UI. Short term, it is absolutely that most pressing issue. Stupefy, stupefy, stupefy. The UI has just left people absolutely scratching their heads, and the more time people have to comb over it and analyze it, the more it becomes true, transparent even, that the UI is missing things. It's out of date. It's not delivering all of the information that it should, as well as not being to people's tastes. Tastes are subjective, but the information is needed. Minor improvements have been seen this week to the yields as well as building descriptions, and these are all positive improvements. A step in the right direction, absolutely, for Civilization 7. For me, the UI remains a thing that it bothers me just sometimes. And much more in some places, like building, specifically overbuilding, than in others, like the bottom right-hand interface for managing the things you need to manage this turn. I think that looks good and works really well. On the stability side of things, we can probably extend it out to bugs as well. I mention it in the sort of frame of reference of multiplayer, but it is, of course, a broader thing too. I run into bugs, the little icon above the unit moves before it or after it, or I click something and it doesn't work, so I have to do it again. These things are generally minor frustrations, but they pop up enough that I do notice them. Multiplayer is sadly not the way that I've experienced this game. In fact, it's never really been the way that I've experienced a Civ. No offense to it, got absolutely nothing against it. I've just kind of always played this game single player. And while as a starting point it might be better than previous Civ iterations, I am not sure it quite has the stability just yet to carry us through. Finally, the overarching and glaring issue beyond the UI, stability leaning perhaps a little bit into multiplayer, is the missing stuff. The stuff people want to see that maybe should have been there and is not. Things like more map variety. It's going to get a little bit stale by the time you reach around the 100 hours mark. You'll start to notice a pattern in the maps, at least I have. It's really quite obvious now. And also other missing things, of course, like the one more turn feature. General pacing as well, perhaps to the modern age most notably. Not just a one more turn feature, but actually just being able to complete a victory condition. Or indeed, enable, disable certain ones, as well as customize other things, maybe like natural features. There are already some settings to adjust the the weight of the crisis event, weight in terms of time. Do you want it to be a brief crisis? Do you want it to play out for a while? Of course, you can adjust the game speed as well, but most of these settings feel quite bare bones. And again, by the time you play a few games, you're going to start to want more. And then, of course, there's the DLC, right? We've seen the roadmap. We know that there's a lot coming to this game. We know that it will be fed to us in sort of series. Here's a leader and a couple of civs, here's a leader and another couple of civs, etc. And it'll probably be like that for a very long time. This is, after all, a Civilization game. And while Civilization 7 may have fared worse in its initial public perception, I believe that the general rule is still true. This is kind of what happens with Civ. It's launched, people dislike it. This time, absolutely there's more, but there's always people who dislike it, and it generally gets better, though it will never be to everyone's taste. And I think, to loop us back to something we talked about at the start of the video, the player counts for the older Civ games, particularly with Civilization 6, in that case just on Steam, it is available on consoles, but really 5 and 6, not Beyond Earth, you can see that actually these games do tend to have quite a longevity. And I don't know for sure, but I'd bet that the people that are playing 5 are generally not the people who are playing 6. Maybe we'll see that play out with 7 as well. Overall, it seems pretty clear to me that Civilization 7 has had a wild and turbulent, roughly first week. Depends where you draw the marker, of course. It's been longer than that, 2 weeks, roughly, if you've had the advanced access. Generally, it seems the fan base, and I have to assume it is mostly the core fan base, particularly those who are paying twice as much to play the game in advanced access. It just must be. The core fan base is very mixed, and the initial reception appears to be worse than it was in previous years and to previous civs. However, we have always seen a general trend like this, and my view, not to try and put on a rose-tinted glass or anything, because we've absolutely discussed the problems with the game right now, but my view is that history will not repeat, but it will rhyme, and we'll see that this game will continue to improve. It will continue to receive updates, not just the paid ones, but crucially also free ones. I'd also imagine that interest will continue to kind of drop off a little bit after the dust settles, after the first weekend or two. But then, like Civilization 6 did probably over the years, and it will be years, pick up over time. Pick up and improve will be the general consensus. Even Beyond Earth improved over time. It is a game that, despite me ripping on it almost always, is actually pretty fun to pick up and play now and again. I was very grateful to have it gifted to me a few years back, and enjoyed my time with it. Just, limited time, every now and again. So, clearly there is more to tell in the story of Civilization 7, and plenty more to unfold. Will my predictions be right over the years? I don't know. It's an eye in the sky kind of thing. I'm a moron on the internet. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I'm sure you will let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Of course, there's plenty more Civilization 7 where that came from, so do stick around, and I'll see you next time.